I'll also discuss about so I'll also discuss about scientific revolution and in medieval Europe. So how actually scientific revolution started in Europe and how actually that took over the whole world and the whole ideology started evolving as per the scientific bias. So we'll discuss on that issue. And then as a result of scientific revolution, it as a result of scientific revolution, what came out is absolute determinism. That we can specify the initial conditions, we can specify the boundary conditions, and we know everything about the system. So that's called absolute determinism. We'll talk about that. So what are the theories and prominent theories that shape the world views, the perception of truth. Then we'll also talk about the triumph of indeterminism. How actually to explain certain phenomena. So we started the era of indeterminism. That means uncertainty. Basically, I'm pointing to quantum mechanics, quantum physics. And the point is how actually the crisis that earlier happened in the evolution of science, scientific revolution, and this time the crisis is altogether totally different. So altogether different. So that crisis led to not only some philosophical crisis, even in many circumstances, even social, political, and moral crisis also. In some way, it's can be connected with that. So then we'll also talk about how actually Vedic science can offer an alternate solution. It can save the current framework of science from the crisis, and it can show a newer paradigm. We'll also talk about whether such things are pseudoscience or whether it can be absurd. So we'll discuss on that. So here is the basis that we are going to discuss. So then let us proceed ahead. So what's the birth of empirical science? So as we know, of course, historians tell that the birthplace of knowledge is actually they say because of Western bias or Western centric ideas. The conception is that the whole understanding of knowledge and everything started from Greece. Greek philosophers they started, but actually careful study shows that Greeks actually borrowed knowledge from the Babylonians, the Arabians, and then later, previously to that, they all took knowledge from Vedic culture. So there are quite a good number of evidences, and we'll slightly touch upon that. So let me start with the pre-Socratic Greek philosopher. Why the name pre-Socratic is used? Because Socrates is a philosopher who made a very drastic change in Western philosophy. And before that, the era was termed as pre-Socratic Greek philosophers, and then afterwards his disciples Plato, Aristotle, all this followed. So let me start with the person who actually contributed to science. So who actually contributed? He's actually Thales of Miletus. So what he did in his unique contribution, he explained natural phenomena. So without resorting to any supernatural explanation. For example, so suppose somebody, as usual, a thinker, when he wants to ponder over the realities of the nature, he actually looks at the sky. Sky is the open ground for that. So then people used to think that actually there are gods of Olympics. They had the conception. So they have the direct intervention, and because of that, things are moving, and because of that, the whole earth is working. Because of that, the tides are moving. Because of that, everything is happening. Every minute phenomena. But then actually, what happened? Thales made a very drastic change. He started explaining phenomena in a natural way. He formed theories, and he actually borrowed ideas, mathematical knowledge from the Babylonians. And by virtue of that, he started using the explaining phenomena in a natural way, other than supernatural explanation. So then his student came, Pythagoras. He further advanced the mathematics, and he used his skills and knowledge from that he inherited from before, so that recognized that Earth is spherical. So of course, in our ancient Vedic traditions, so we see that such descriptions are there. But anyway, so historically, he is said to be the one who said that Earth is spherical. So that way, the whole era of mathematics started. Mathematics gives an objective handle over truth, because as mathematics evolved, people started controlling the thought that they can control the nature, because they predict the nature. So that was the era. So what happened? So Pythagoras, what he did, he discovered some correlated fixed ratio musical harmonies like octave, fifth, fourth, and gave the idea that actually mathematics can capture the whole essence of the world. So like all the students who are in the science background, so in the high school days or even in the college days, they might have studied the standing waves. Waves, how actually it forms nodes and antinodes, and how depending on the antinode node, number of antinodes and number of nodes, the frequency changes. I mean, the whole sound vibration changes. So that is how he noted the fixed ratios. On the strings instruments, he noticed how actually this particular melodies, particular tunes are associated with some particular length of fragments of string lengths. So he thought that actually he can project this observation to the whole universe. That means universe is the functioning of the universe is just like a big symphony. So it's a big kind of musical harmony. In that way he thought. And he thought that this mathematics can make a miracle. So that was the idea that went very deep inside. So that went really very deep inside. So that is how actually it started the era of Pythagorean orientation. That is this book, Historical Introduction to Philosophy of Science by J.L. Losey. So he says that. So later philosophers, they inherited that Pythagorean orientation. So then came the famous philosopher Socrates. So often many Vedic scholars, they say that Socrates is one who realized that he is not his own body. You can see he is pointing his finger up. So that he shows that the reality is actually up, not in this world. So then, and he used to challenge openly. His political philosophy is that he openly challenged the state and openly challenged the dogma that people used to carry. And because of that, he was forced to drink the deadly poison, hemlock. And he agreed that because you cannot catch me, because I am not this body. He considered like that. Then his Socrates never wrote any book on his own. He used to engage in dialogues, and that mood was carried by his student Plato. Plato actually, all we know about Socrates is through Plato's writing. So this is a famous painting. So from there I just picked the photo of Plato. So Plato opened the academy, Plato's academy. There many great philosophers were trained. So and among them was Aristotle. Aristotle is also told that by historians that he was the one who tutored Alexander the Great. And of course later he resigned from there. So and this Plato and Aristotle made dramatic changes, and basically you can say the founding stones they laid for Western philosophy and Western thought, Western think tank. And prominent philosophers, these are the prominent philosophers, basically Aristotle and Plato, who governed the whole think tank of Europe, Western culture for 1500 years. My goodness. So for 1500 years, people in some way or other they followed these two people. So what was the idea of Plato? So Plato, they might have heard, because these ideas are very similar to the Pancha Mahabhut that is described in our Vedic culture. So he thought that the fundamental objects of this world are fire, air, water, earth. And he hypothetically gave some shapes to them. That you can see he imagined that that the earth element could be just like a cube, and the water element is just like icosahedron. Of course, water molecules resemble icosahedron, and he thought that the air one would be just like octahedron, and fire one would be just like tetrahedron. And then they thought that the whole universe is something very symmetrical. So what's the most symmetrical thing? So as a geometrical object, they assigned that dodecahedron, which is very close to sphere. So that's the most symmetrical thing, and the universe must be like that. So these are all mere speculations. So, so the book Timaeus, so that's the early book that describes the analytical understanding of matter and many more things. So that was by Plato. So the problem is that so these ideas like the fundamental entities of earth, water, air, fire are not really the way actually Vedic culture proposes. We'll discuss toward the end of the slides that what's the Vedic phenomenal model, or what is also called Sankhya philosophy, and how it describes the earth, water, air, fire, and ether. And so these elements not to be confused with earth, like earth we hear, or water, the water we see, the air that we perceive, the fire we see, or the ether that we think that the space is permeated with. So they have nothing to do with all these things, because these elements are very subtle, very subtle. They cannot be perceived by, with naked eyes, of course, certainly not. So these because in Sanskrit the words are used in a very multifaceted way. I mean, multiple terms are used, multiple meanings are ascribed to the single word. So these apparently this Bhumi, Anala, Vayu, all these things really do not refer to the earth, water, fire, air that we think of. So they are very fundamental and very different, and that we'll discuss towards the end. But anyway, so the Greek philosophy, the Greek idea that matter could be composed of all these 5 fundamental things, it's all speculation, because they had deep trust on geometry. They were thinking that the Greek philosophers used to think that geometry is something that can capture the essence of the world. And of course it came from the Pythagorean orientation, because all of them are successors of Pythagoras. And so that is how the story goes. So this is a famous painting by Raphael, the medieval painting, Renaissance time painting. So there you can see the depiction it's not abstract. So all these people, every individual is one individual great philosopher. Just like you can see, there is one old person sitting on the floor, on the ashes. So he is the stairs. So he is actually Pythagoras, and there is many others are like that. And the prominent one that are shown in the center stage are Plato and Aristotle. So Plato is shown with his finger, index finger raised up, and Aristotle is showing that the flat hand. So what does it signify? So Plato says actually the unchanging, he called something forms, and unchanging eternal forms are in the eternal world, and that's not this world. He says that that's in the heaven. And but his student Aristotle, he differed from him. He says actually the reality of the world is in this world only, and the forms that you are saying, that's in this world. And from Aristotle actually the whole scientific or you could say the natural philosophy started in a very polished way. And because he described that the reality is to be found in this world, there is no need of searching for reality in the some heaven or something. He called that if at all God is there, he is unmoved mover. That means he has nothing to do with this world. And he imagined that this world has to be, he thought that this world has to be eternal, and not the heaven. This world, this earth has to be eternal. And it's eternally situated at one place, and the whole cosmos is revolving around earth. He thought like that. And his ideas was carried forward for 1500 years, till Renaissance time when it was severely challenged. So I'll go forward fast because many more things are to be covered. So his unique contribution is scientific method. So what scientific method is? So first of all, one makes an observation. One comes to induction. That means I really cannot make observation for all the cases all over the world. I cannot check all the birds in this world and conclude that they're all or black or all white. I can never do that. But I can certainly do what? I can measure certain areas and certain words and make a hypothesis out of that. And so that's called induction. That I prove, I check with some observations and then I generalize. So that's then you deduce from that general hypothesis or premise, you deduce further theories. And then you go on testing and evaluate and further you make observation, change it. Like that the whole scientific method goes. It's self-correcting, ideas. That means science evolves. The reality, the picture that Aristotle proposed as the method of truth, that evolves. That means there is no fixed reality. But in contrast, let me talk about the Vedic method of thinking, critical thinking. So that's called Nyaya. So out of the 6 kinds of philosophies that Vedic literature talk about, so Nyaya is the one, logic. So that talks, suppose I give you a observation that on the mountain there is fire. So what could be the reason? So that's a proposition to be proved. So the 5-fold syllogical statements that it gives, reason, that the reason is that there is smoke. I see that there is smoke, that's why maybe there is fire. But how do I know? Then the third one is, that's called general premise with an example. That whenever there is smoke, or maybe whenever my mother, it refers to the rural context, that the mother is preparing food, so he is lighting the stove, the modern stove prepared out of mud. So that gives rise to smoke. So the observation is that whenever there is smoke, there is fire. So, then this general premise with an example that makes the case, the hypothesis practical. So then the application is that indeed there is smoke on the mountain, because I see from my own observation that whenever there is light, there is whenever there is fire, there is smoke. So the application is that the premise that I have taken, the hypothesis I have taken, that there is fire on the mountain because there is smoke. But has it, does it refer to all possibilities? There could be smoke because of volcanic eruptions. There could be smoke because of some fumes that are coming out of the earth. Or there could be fire before and there was rain and the fire is extinguished and the smoke is there. So it could be that. So always this inductive method is always not correct. It's prone to error. In our Vedic culture, this kind of epistemological standing is, or the proofs or the pramanas are called pratyaksha pramana and anumana pramana. So the perception, direct perception and logical inference. That's always not the correct. Vedic knowledge talks about a third kind of proof, which actually always misunderstood. That's called sabda pramana. That the knowledge itself is revealed itself. That content of the knowledge and the knowledge are the same. So when the knowledge is revealed directly, it doesn't require any other proof to substantiate it. That's called sabda pramana. That is how the whole Vedic tradition evolved. But in contrast, the same thing was deeply misunderstood in Greek philosophy. Greek philosophy, they used to talk that ipse dixit. That means one philosopher used to say that because I say this or because my master said this, it has to be true. That's Vedic culture talks that as Laukika Sabda. That means it's this Sabda is not so well founded. So what Vedic knowledge is founded on? It's founded on the Apaurusheya Sabda. That means the knowledge is it's referring to the eternal truth. So anyway, so that's a different discussion. So that's not part of today's main focus. So the conclusion is that the fire on mountain is not indubitable. It can be very well challenged. So then, so the whole, so this was just to give a contrast with Vedic ideas with Greek philosophy. So now, these ideas continued further. And as Christianity started in Europe, and Christianity or any Abrahamic religions, they really didn't have much philosophical backing. And people had natural queries of this world, how the world is functioning, and the philosophy and the religion, they are considered two different sections as it evolved in Western culture. But in Vedic culture, it's a totally different, holistic thing. So one cannot distinguish what's Vedic culture I mean, one cannot find Vedic culture different from Vedic science or Vedic way of lifestyle. So it's all integrated. So, but that was not the case in Western philosophy, because the philosophy and the religion, they were two different sections. And as time evolved, as the Roman Empire expanded everywhere, the whole knowledge of Greeks, that also flourished. And soon what happened? So the western part of the Roman Empire collapsed after the fall of Alexander the Great. So then, because of that, the whole propagation of knowledge was stopped, practically stopped. But certain areas that continued. So let us see. So after the fall of Western Roman Empire, the Eastern Byzantine Empire continues to flourish. And then the two prominent centers that emerged, that are Constantinople and Alexandria. So then that becomes the center of learning. But in 12th century, what happened? People started really objecting the monasteries, the teachings of the Bible. And center of learning shifted from the monasteries to the newly developed universities. People started putting much trust on rational inquiry rather than that you said something so I'll believe. So not that kind of thing. People wanted some rational verification, and the whole era started. The explosion of knowledge started from there. And what happened? People that time many traditional Latin classics and these things were made available, and many literatures were translated from Greek and to Latin. So that made the whole content of the knowledge widespread. And soon Aristotelian literature and logic and philosophy and the scientific background that he laid forward, so that became the foundation of the worldview, the think tank, all over the Europe. But then in 1348 something happened, that the Great Plague outbroke and everything was stopped. But soon people learned, in the early part of 15th century, people learned the use of gunpowder. So gunpowder gave the power to control other nations. Then Gutenberg designed printing press. By that time papyrus was already made available, and after the discovery of invention of printing press, so the whole ideas were disseminated all over the Europe very fast. And then the compass was also discovered. So the compass made everybody capable of navigating. Like earlier, people used to think that the whole earth is the center of the whole creation, and all the universe is revolving around that, and there are only three continents. So Africa, Europe and Asia, nothing else. But later people found America is there, North America, South America, then there is Australia. So then later, of course, much later was Antarctica found. So, so when new continents were discovered, that seriously challenged Aristotelian ideas. And soon many astronomical discoveries were also made. That further shattered the ideas of Aristotle. So that was the story, how actually people started questioning Aristotelian philosophy, which was once the founding, the founding stone of the whole philosophy, whole discussion, whole intellectual efforts. That was started. That was in question basically. So, so what are the major reasons of scientific revolution in Europe? So, the intellectual crisis that happened in Europe, because people started who trusted the whole Aristotelian philosophy and the ideas that were laid forward. So they found otherwise because of discoveries of instruments and technology. So people, and of course, as a church as an institution, it couldn't defend the metaphysical realities that it used to ascribe for things. So people wanted some natural explanation for that. So, and of course, the church was corrupted, and the papal authority exercised their power. So because of that, people started rejecting any authority. That will reject Aristotelian philosophy, will reject church philosophy, and that is how actually basically the Renaissance started. People rejected Aristotelic philosophy but accepted Plato's philosophy, because Plato's philosophy was saying that this earth is not eternal, and the heaven is eternal, and his ideas were very much like very close to Vedic ideas and very solid also. People started instead of Aristotelian philosophy, they started adopting Plato's works. And of course, as I told, the Abrahamic religions couldn't depend people's natural inquiry. And then later, when things were translated and people started discovering, rediscovered Greek classics, that made an explosion of knowledge. And whole Europe was swept away with the scientific revolution and Renaissance. So then, after scientific revolution, naturally came industrial innovations. People actually use science to control the nature, okay, to harness the potential of nature. So, like many industries started, coal mine and all these things were started, and textile industry flourished like anything. So that's it. People got an opportunity to enhance their economy and purchasing power. So that's why public and government support came for empirical science. And earlier, nobody imagined that philosophy and science could be practiced outside of philosophy or religion. So that became very prominent. That people started, emphasizing that there is no need of God. So that was another intellectual crisis or philosophical crisis that happened with the rise of empirical science. That we can objectively verify everything. With the development of mathematics and calculus and all these things, people started objectively understanding the world. So emergence of large-scale industrialization happened. And what happened by that? So empirical science and technology became a new means to control nature. That is what everybody wanted, to control the nature, to harness the power. And that made it possible. So science, empirical science became the backbone of the truth. And that made rapid changes, and atheistic materialism became widespread. So that was another layer of crisis that happened in European society. So people became totally convinced of the mechanical understanding of reality in every sphere of life. So earlier, so it's a very interesting history. People can, the viewers can, in a leisure time, they can Google and maybe Britannica Encyclopedia or any other good encyclopedia. They can look for how actually science evolved, the history and philosophy of science. It's a very interesting thing. How actually people started thinking that everything could be mechanized. Earlier, some people actually believed that there is soul and we are some divine beings. But then people as basically Harvey, he showed that actually the whole body could be studied and anatomical understanding, he gave very nice anatomical understanding. And by that time, industries were also evolving. People were controlling, doing experiments, and telescopes were discovered, and many things were happening. So then people started thinking that actually everything could be mechanized, that everything has a mechanical explanation. So we can describe everything through our logic, our mathematics, our instruments. So, and then they thought that this body is also the human being or any species is also, or she is also like a machine, and it can be described by the laws of nature. And of course, when industry started, much of the intelligentsia was diverted towards technological innovations. And among them, the prominent one was Leonardo da Vinci. I think many of us have heard of his genius, that how actually he was a great painter, great sculptor, and many things, a great engineer. So with the beginning of, so this was a bit of history. So now we'll start a bit of science. So, so with the scientific revolution, so what started is the era of absolute determinism. That means, determinism means if I can specify the initial conditions, so I know what's going to happen in the next, because that is how I'll control the whole thing. unless I know what's going to happen next, and whether if I cannot predict the functioning of the world, the phenomena, so how I'm going to harness the power? So as everything was thought of being mechanized, that everything could be described as machines, and that started the era of absolute determinism. So to help, that was helped by the theories that evolved at that time. So the prominent intellectual crisis that fired scientific revolution was basically the battle for Earth and Sun. So for a long time, the followers of Aristotle, basically the idea came from Ptolemy, the early Greek philosopher, that the Earth is the center of the whole creation, and everything, sun and all, everything is moving around that. But then, as the scientific revolution was progressing, Copernicus, he happened to visit Italy. So there he got infected with that idea of explaining nature and using mathematics and all that. And you will be surprised, till his death, he was practically on a deathbed. He completed his 6 volumes of treatise on astronomy. And that was the first time in the whole of intellectual history that it thoroughly challenged the old ideas, and it gave a very strong foundation for empirical astronomy without relying on God or any metaphysical being or divine being or any Olympus god or anything like that. But then, of course, he couldn't explain many things, the astronomical facts. So then came Tycho Brahe. Tycho Brahe actually thought that he quite correctly predicted the solar system, but still he believed that Earth is the center. And then Galileo came. He discovered, he designed telescopes, and he showed the craters on the moon, and the spots on sun. He found many satellites revolving around the planets, different planets, and he showed that the moon is revolving around the earth, and like that, he one by one after another, he made many basically challenges to the upheld understanding till that time. So that was a big intellectual crisis and the inquiry of truth. So okay, the Copernicus, Tycho Brahe, and Kepler also gave his laws, as many people, all of us have studied in our undergraduate days, the Kepler's laws, how actually sun is at the center. Basically, Earth is revolving around a ellipse, and one of the foci, at one of the foci, the sun is there. So, and there are the area swept by the aerial velocity is fixed. So that many things that he gave very nicely predicted, and that was empirically also observed. So that idea is actually these 4 people so rationally challenged the whole conception of earlier philosophers that people for all time to came, they gave up believing any authority for blindly. So they wanted everything to be observed, empirically verified. And everybody had strong faith that once we specify the initial conditions and the boundary conditions, and we know how the system is going to evolve. So that's the era of absolute determinism. Kepler gave his laws, and Copernicus gave some ideas, and all these were very deterministic ideas that I can predict, I can control. But then I think I missed one famous person, Newton. So, but all these ideas were not explaining how actually the motion is happening. So, how when the particles are moving, what actually governs their motion, or the planetary system, how they're revolving, how the Earth is revolving around the sun, why it is not falling on the sun, and like that, the many understandings were not clear. So, Newton came, and people also by that time were thinking that there is no need of God, and we can explain things through science. And Newton came, and he established that God as a grand designer. And the ideas that he gave, the Newton's laws, very deterministic ideas, and the laws of motion basically, and then the laws of gravitation. But one thing he thought that he couldn't explain that earlier the Greeks have believed that the whole creation is permeated with ether. They considered that ether is something that is some physical object that is can see that it's permeated all over the creation, and when the planets are moving in the ether drag. So that they couldn't explain, and how actually the sun is not falling in the earth is not falling in the sun, or any planet is not falling in the sun. So Newton thought that actually it's a direct intervention of divine power. So that he couldn't explain. He thought that, of course, certainly the force of gravitation is there. He gave the laws, but that as a really something solid force that makes that doesn't really make the planets fall on the sun. He could explain that. But then soon later, who came? Laplace. So Laplace made an axiomatic foundation for Newton's laws. And what we know as classical mechanics, classical physics, he gave the cornerstone. He laid the cornerstone for that. So Laplace showed that if you fluctuate in the circular orbit little bit, so that's not going to disturb the planets, because when you fluctuate little bit, that oscillates, and that way the planets are stable. So he showed that, and that totally shattered the Newton's idea that God is a grand designer and who is actually making the whole thing revolve by direct intervention. So that was overthrown. So like that, there are many intellectual crises that kept on happening, and then I'm fast forwarding, so because we have less of time now. So in the early part of 19th century, people were also discovered electricity, magnetism, all these things were discovered. Faraday's law, this Gauss law and everything were discovered. But there was no solid foundation to unify everything. So what Maxwell did for the first time in the history, so he made a unified framework for the whole of classical physics. It was basically electricity and magnetism. He combined electricity and magnetism in a single framework, and that we know in his Maxwell's equations. Those who study classical mechanics, particularly the electromagnetism in its form. So these are the differential and integral forms of the Maxwell's equations. That was for the first time what such a genius thing, that two opposing things, electricity and magnetism, was combined on a single footing. That means electricity can give rise to magnetism, magnetism can give rise to electricity. But that was not the end of the story, and of course by that time many things had happened. Darwin had already given the ideas of natural selection, and I'm not going into those details, how actually biological forms evolved from a common species, and those ideas became very rampant, and people had already overthrown the idea of God, that God is something needed really in our life. So that was the atheistic materialism was keeping its handle more and more deeper, stronger. So, so that happened, and that never stopped also. So what intellectually happened at that time was that people were thinking there are only two problems left over. The early part of 19th century, later part of 19th century and the earlier part of 20th century. So even the great physicist Max Planck, he used to tell his students that see, actually the physics is over. So you can do all precision studies, and you can do experiments, you design instruments and verify, you have full control over the nature, because we have deterministically controlled everything. We know everything. We know the laws of nature, laws of motion, laws of gravitation, and electricity, magnetism was solidly given a strong foundation by Maxwell. So everything is over. Only two problems are remaining: ether drift problem and black body spectrum. So this is a reminiscent idea of ether, that people used to think the whole creation is permeated with ether. It's luminiferous ether, and when the earth is moving with the ether, it's dragging the ether with it. And so when the light is from the sun, it's coming. So the light itself, because it's traveling in the medium, so just like when sound wave is traveling in the medium, and if you make disturbances in the medium, so the whole sound wave gets disturbed. So like that, people thought that so the electromagnet, basically the light wave that is being affected by the ether drag. So that couldn't be explained. How actually people expected that in different seasons there could be different fluctuations on a special instrument called interferometer. So I'm not going into the technical details of that. So that's the famous experiment, the Michelson-Morley experiment. So that actually strongly overthrew the idea of ether. But then people had nothing to explain how everything is moving. So this ether drift problem remained, and then the black body spectrum. So you can see this every hot object behaves like a black body. So you can it emits wavelengths in in all bands. So depending on the temperature, so it has a pattern. So with the use of deterministic classical mechanics, so one could either explain the left part or one could explain the right part. But the whole curve, the black body spectrum, nobody could explain in a single framework. So that was a puzzle for a long time, but people nevertheless didn't consider that a big problem. But that continued. But Planck himself, in the early part of 19th century, so he gave the idea of quantum mechanics, and the ether drag problem was solidly solved by Einstein. He gave the idea of special relativity in 1905. I think that time. So in the first part of 20th century, so Albert Einstein gave a very different notion of understanding. That was again another intellectual crisis. That people never imagined that space and time could be combined in a single framework. So Einstein devised the geometry in such a way that he also made many strong, solid propositions. The speed of light is the maximum. So transmission of information, and there is nothing that can communicate with each other with infinite speed. So just like Newton's law, just see Newton's law. So suppose I have a object, say the length of the earth. Suppose I tap on the one end, the other end automatically the force is transmitted, the information is transmitted. So that was the idea of Newton. The information, just like when you kick on just like a footballer in a game, when he kicks on the ball, directly on the front face he kicks and the back face immediately receives the reaction. So that was the idea of Newton, that or a classical mechanics basically. So the information from one end to other is transmitted with infinite speed. And of course, Newton believed that the whole creation is eternal, because there was no conception of beginning of the creation, because there was no science to explain that. So all these ideas were very much a part of deterministic framework, and people were carried away by that. But then these things were strongly challenged by the ideas that evolved. Einstein with special relativity in 1915 and general relativity in 1925. So he thoroughly revised the notion of reality, how it could be, what it could be. So that was a big change, and special relativity was a big intellectual effort. And then to add to that, when Einstein gave the idea of general relativity, it was like amazing. It was amazing. The gravitation was no longer a force. Earlier, what Newton thought, it's another intellectual crisis that happened. That earlier people thought that gravitation is a force, but here what Einstein showed, that actually because of the whenever a massive object is there, it deforms the space-time curvature, and depending on the mass or the curvature, the particles at the masses are evolving or making motions. So he said that the geodesics describe the motion. So anyway, these are technical details, and on the very fundamental assumption of something called equivalence principle. So he devised all these things, and that was just a very wonderful idea. And till date, nobody has proved him wrong. After 100 years, nobody has proved him wrong. And general relativity is again and again and again with precision. with many decimal digits. So it's getting proved. So that's a very strong foundation of modern science, and it totally challenges the rational way of thinking, that the way we are perceiving the world, the way we are thinking. So that was, I would say, the last intellectual effort of the part of deterministic thing. But now the whole thing is to start. The triumph of, as I say, it's a triumph of indeterminism and the crisis. So what's the crisis again? So let me describe a classical experiment. Suppose you toss a coin. So all of us who have studied a little bit of statistics, we know the probability of getting a head or a tail, how much it is. So I cannot interact with my viewers. Had it been a Zoom meeting or Google Meet or something like that, I could have asked the question. So what's the probability of getting a head or a tail in this tossing of coin? Of course, we know it's 50-50, 50%. 50% of the times, if I make hundreds, thousands of experiments, 50% of the time I'll get head and 50% of the time I'll get a tail. But that is not really randomness. That is not really probability. It may be a little bit surprising to few, because as you can see, this coin, you can trace its back by following its immediate neighbor, immediate precursor. So like that, from the last position of the coin to the very first position, very precisely, if I know the laws of nature, laws of motion, Newton's law and everything, I can perfectly describe the projectile motion and describe the outcome of the tossing of coin. So really it is not a probability. So classical probability is a misnomer. So why I say classical probability? Because so this is the understanding that gave rise to statistical mechanics also. So the very foundation of thermodynamics. So the point is this idea that because I do not know certain variables, because why I say that the probability is 50-50, because I do not know I do not want to calculate every step, and that information is hidden to me. It's some variables that are hidden to me. So because of that, I cannot predict the outcome exactly, and because of that, I ascribe the probability 50-50. It's basically the classical probability is ignorance. So the result of ignorance. But that is not the case that came with with the rise of quantum physics. To explain black body radiation, Planck gave the idea of quantum mechanics, that energy states are quantized. So no longer the energies are continuous things. So it takes discrete values. So that's a very radical idea. Nobody earlier intellectually believed or accepted such things. How can something like energy could be discrete things? That was amazing. That was a great intellectual crisis for many. Even great stalwarts like Einstein couldn't believe that it could be true. For all through his life, he fought with the idea that quantum mechanics could be true. So what's wrong with quantum mechanics? So what made him puzzled is that let us go to the famous experiment that's called Stern-Gerlach experiment. It was the ideas were given by Stern and Gerlach in 1922. That very nicely describes what's quantum probability. Suppose there are, it's already late, so I'll go fast. So suppose there are two magnets, North Pole and South Pole, and I'm injecting a beam of electrons on that. Suppose I send beams of a few electrons at a time. And what was classically believed that when the electrons would be would be filtered through slits, a narrow slit, and on the screen when it would be observed, we'll see a continuous halo, continuous spectrum. But that was not the case. And what was observed was two thin lines. As you can see on the photographic plate, there is just two thin lines. Instead of a full band, filled band, I am getting two thin lines. So that was a big puzzle. How is that possible? And even if I make one electron go at one time, so suppose I send one electron, wait for 1 second, send another electron, say wait for another second, or maybe few fraction of second. So, but still this interference pattern was observed. It was something like amazing. So, like I can just like thinking of like one electron in future is interacting with interfering with one electron in the past. That was a tantalizing idea. That was a great intellectual crisis, I would say. That could never be accepted by Einstein and many others. But the opponent parties, Heisenberg and Niels Bohr, all of them fought, and many debates, heated debates, continued with Einstein's party and Bohr's party. And of course, Einstein couldn't defend. So in the process, he gave a very nice idea. So let me quickly. So what I was talking about quantum probability is that I really cannot predict the outcome unless and until I observe the system. I cannot predict what's going to come. So like tossing of the coin, even if I do not observe and later I come to see what's there, it's there. It's a classical one. But in quantum system, I really cannot say what's the nature of the system, where it is, and what's its momentum. If I can specify its velocity or its momentum, I cannot specify where it is. Just like it could be spread all over the universe. If I can fix its momentum, its velocity, that means it would be spread all over the universe. My goodness, it is such a different idea. Totally challenges the common sense. And that too, when such things are projected, made to go through slits, and when it is projected on the photographic plate, I see it's two narrow beams instead of the full pattern. So that's amazing nature and very surprising, confusing nature of quantum mechanics. That also goes by the name measurement problem. That unless and until I measure the system, I really do not know what's going there. So that's a big puzzle. Deterministic world started that we could exactly predict the motion of the world, the motion of the objects, control the nature. But here in quantum mechanics, we really do not know what's going to happen next. So what I can do is I can make a statistical prediction that happened to be precisely true till date. But the ontological, sorry for a little bit of philosophical jargons, the ontological nature of the quantum states, that what it is actually, that is thoroughly challenged. I can say I know this screen what it is, its height and its width and its dimension, its density, everything I know. But when I refer to quantum system, I really do not know what is there unless until observe it. So in some sense, so the idea of observer has scripted. So, so the properties of system, what earlier people thought that it has to be objective. Mathematics, with the help of primary properties of nature, it was thinking that we can make everything objectively verifiable. But now the whole idea became subjective. That unless and until I measure a system, unless and until a person measures it, he doesn't know what's there. So its subjective experience is there coming into picture. But of course, quantum mechanics circumvents this problem by statistical analysis. That means I make many observations and I know the statistical average of that. So that is perfect. But at the single event level, I do not know what the system is. I do not know objective handle. So that's a subjective thing. So that's a foundation. That's till date, even though quantum mechanics is formulated more than 100 years, till date people are very seriously working on this thing. Recently, a very big scientist, Smolin, who gave the idea of loop quantum gravity, he wrote a book on the foundation of quantum mechanics. In his lecture where he inaugurated his book, he mentioned that some people may be thinking that I am talking stupid, that there is no crisis in the intellectual thing. So there is why actually we are talking about foundation of quantum mechanics, because at its very foundation it is very shallow. We do not know what the system is. It's the whole idea of objective verification came that we separated the observer from the system. That I can verify here, somebody in America, he can verify the same, given the same setup. But here, a framework is there, which is apparently very successful, but at the single event level, it doesn't know what's there. So that's the intellectual crisis that still there with quantum mechanics, and it calls for the role of observer. Let me go quickly. So this is the double slit experiment. So this is the double slit experiment. So this is the double slit experiment that shows actually how actually electron, which is just like a particle, it can work like a wave. So that is a strange thing. And light, which is otherwise a wave, it could be thought of just like a particle in the photoelectric effect. So I'm not going to details. So in a nutshell, so Heisenberg gave the uncertainty principle that one cannot precisely determine quantities like the canonical quantities at a time. Either I can measure the position or either I can measure the momentum. So then this idea of EPR paradox came. That was basically Einstein's challenge to Bohr, how actually the quantum randomness, how it's not possible. He thought that quantum mechanics is incomplete. That's why it's giving such statistical understanding. So that came that gave the idea of EPR paradox. What is that? So suppose there are two entangled systems. Entangled systems means the quantum state of the two combined systems cannot be described separately. I have to describe them together. So suppose I prepared a pure entangled state and I separated them universe apart. So then, suppose I make a measurement on one system, the other system automatically flips. So suppose spin is oriented towards the z-axis. So then as I observe it, say let's it's plus half in the other half of the universe. So where the other part of the integral system is there, it measures minus half. So that was a very strange thing. So what Einstein thought, so that see, it is a limitation of quantum mechanics. But that was later Bell proposed the Bell inequality and all that. So so that was the thing that came with the ideas of Einstein, the EPR paradox, and that gave the notion of entangled system. And Bell, he gave some very wonderful ideas in 1970s. So the Bell inequality that shows actually quantum mechanics is perfectly valid, and there is no local violation. So local causality is not disturbed. So what Einstein thought, so that two systems are apart quite far. So and the information is transmitted with infinite speed. That is defying the notion of relativity. That information cannot be basically transmitted with faster than the speed of light. That's not possible. But here it's happening. And later Bell and others showed that actually it's a non-local interaction. So it's not really violating the causality. I'm not going into the technical details of that. So what it really points till date is that quantum mechanics has problems, and many people started thinking that maybe some hidden variable can help, but Bell's inequality strongly overrules any local hidden variables. So that's a very technical detail. So in a nutshell, it says that quantum mechanics has some serious fundamental issues. But nevertheless, with the quantum mechanics is now promising us quantum computers. Not only that, in every walk of our life, maybe it's the production of detergent, or maybe our silicon chips, or many things we talk about electronics. So everywhere, our satellites, everywhere quantum mechanics is in play. So till now, none of the theories that have shown that quantum mechanics is, none of the observations have disproved quantum mechanics in a statistical level. But at single event level, till date, we do not know how to address that intellectual crisis. We do not know. Until date, people are working on this Schrodinger's cat paradox. So that very nicely describes how actually the quantum mechanics is quantum mechanics actually is flawed and when applied to macroscopic systems. So macroscopic systems, that is quantum mechanics is not applicable. Suppose I make a thought experiment that there is a cat which is inside a room and there is a 50-50 probability that a radioactive decay would happen. As soon as the decay would happen, some poisonous gas would be emitted and the cat would be dead. So, if I apply quantum mechanics to the cat, I would say the cat is the superposition of 50% dead state, 50% alive state. But it doesn't really make sense. So, in our natural understanding, there is no such cat as 50% alive, 50% dead. It totally defies common sense. It's not possible at all. So quantum mechanics, although wonderfully successful in statistical thing at microscopic systems, it miserably fails at microscopic systems. And if at all quantum mechanics has to explain the whole thing, so there is no way that we can describe the whole world, because microscopic system is a very small fragment of the whole reality. Microscopic system we have to explain, and quantum mechanics thoroughly fails. So Einstein's general theory of relativity and everything, so the ideas he gave, that is applicable for macroscopic systems. But quantum mechanics is applicable for the microscopic systems. So these two apparent ideas cannot be combined together. So till now there are many speculations like of making unified theories. So that is till date it's continuing, but till now it's not yet successful. So what's the problem with this kind of reductionist scientific model? Let me describe a thing that I earlier also described in some seminar on consciousness. So let us model a child who is playing. So I can describe in terms of flow of proteins. Further, I can go down with the motion of the atom, the electrons, the nucleus. I can go down further and describe in terms of quarks and the leptons and all. I can go down further and describe in terms of in mathematics. Now the child, the baby, is now described in terms of mathematics. Further, when such thing is described in terms of binary numbers, so that became stored in my hard disk. I can throw my hard disk. Can a parent throw his child? Not at all possible. So this scientific model, which we are so proud of, it actually poses an intellectual crisis, a big intellectual gap, a need for paradigm shift that it calls for. That the observer, the consciousness is no longer the part of the system. I can describe the body, everything, matter, everything deterministically. But what about the consciousness? What about the observer? Quantum mechanics actually is indicating that. So unless and until the observer makes his intervention, till that point I do not know what the observation is in precise manner. I lose the idea. So that's something very fundamental, and we need to think about that. So materialistic reductionism actually fails. So as not only in life, as I project such reductionist ideas to cosmos, so even the Einstein theory of relativity fails. So that I do not know what's the time, what's the nature of time, how the whole space and time started. I may say that it started from Big Bang, but what happened before Big Bang? So what is Big Bang? We do not really know much about that. So unless and until we make a very solid framework for quantum mechanics, and unless and until we make a solid foundation for microscopic and macroscopic systems together, So that's a dream of the unified theories that people are thinking of, dreaming of. So till that point we do not know. Even if we do know that, but that will only describe matter. But what about consciousness? So, and what about the cosmos? How it started? So there are great puzzles, great intellectual hurdles that is lying before us. Just like the crisis that happened in the medieval time in Europe, people were one after another facing observations and Aristotelian ideas were not able to explain. Although quantum mechanics is able to explain in a pragmatic sense, but in a very theoretical and philosophical sense, it fails. So that was the dream of Einstein, and of course, all through his life, he tried to make such a framework, but he never was successful. And that problem is still open for everybody. And so in the search of a theory of everything, science is really helpless at this point. So at this crossroad, what's going to show us the direction? So there is one alternative. There is one idea that often cited in the philosophy of science given by the Thomas Kuhn. So he wrote a very popular, very well-written book, philosophically sound book, The Structure of Scientific Revolution. He actually showed how actually the revolution in science takes place in phases. How actually as one idea is widespread and then there is some intellectual crisis and another idea is put forward and there is an intellectual crisis with new observation, like that it goes on. Now the intellectual crisis is a very different sense. We are trying to explain a theory of everything. That means it should explain not only the dead matter, it should explain the sentient beings, consciousness. But till now we have no scope of consciousness in the solid framework of science, in the framework of physics. So, but Vedic science and is not like that. Vedic science and Vedic philosophy, Vedic religion, everything is part of the one framework, one holistic framework. So, that is very different from Western society, Western culture. So this Vedic science may help us for alternative paradigm. So we'll see. Let's see whether it's an absurd thought or it really has some potential. So how Vedic science and philosophy is different from other religion is that it gives a very rational framework. So it's perfectly amenable to rational inquiry. So one can, the Sankhya philosophy, the Nyaya, and the Sardarshan, so that gives a very strong foundation for rational thing. So now the whole literature is before us. Only thing is that we have to understand in a proper context. So let me go quickly. So one example of Vaisheshika Sutra. So that was very famous in one of the famous 6 philosophies, and it was given a modern scientific perspective by Subhas Kak, the professor of artificial intelligence in Oklahoma State University. So he wrote a book, very nice book, Matter and Mind, the Vaisheshika Sutra of Kanal. So here I don't have much time, we are already running short of time. So he actually projected, made comparisons with the Kanada's laws that he has given and the Newton's laws. It's very much similar, just like let's say the law 1, Sanyoga Bhave Gurutvat Patanam. In the absence of conjunction, gravity causes the objects to fall. So just like the inertia motion. So object which is in motion keeps moving, one which is static, it remains static unless force is applied. In the second law, in the absence of force, there is no upward motion, sideward motion in general. Like that he compared the Newton's law, the laws in Vaisheshika Sutra. The laws in Vaisheshika Sutra, the ideas of Vaisheshika Sutra is not only limited to matter only, it has description for space, time, matter and observer. It's such a wonderful thing. Observer is not yet part of the scientific framework yet. So quantum mechanics next revolution is going to happen once we define ontological quantum states and include the role of observer. So in that direction, I came across a very interesting words that could be potential direction for empirical research. So it's from Srimad Bhagavatam, It's called the natural commentary for Vedanta Sutra, which is the highest level of philosophy. Basically, the greatest philosophy in the six darshans. So here it says Bhutanam Chidradatutyam Bahirantam Ramevacha Pranendriyatma Tishnatvam Navaso Briti Lakshanam. So what it says, the activities and the characteristics of ethereal element can be observed as the accommodation of room for ethereal and internal existence for all living entities, namely the field of activities, the vital air, the senses and the mind. So apparently these words may be appearing jugglery. So what it says, so he says that the ethereal element is not to be confused with the Greek idea of luminiferous ether. Here it gives a very different understanding of ether. I'll discuss shortly. So ethereal element is the framework where subtle forms can exist. Subtle forms means Vedic literature talks about subtle and gross forms. Gross forms are made of Pancha Mahabhut, Kshiti, Rapa, Analo, Vayu. So all this Pancha Mahabhut makes the gross form, and the subtle form is made of mind, intelligence and false ego, the sense of false identity. So in a later discussion, we'll discuss detailed about this Sankhya philosophy and its scientific implications. But at this point, I would say that this word says that how actually the nature of matter and the nature of mind and how it is connected to ethereal element. So that is very something fundamental. And how what Vedic literature called a tanmatra, and how it could be objectively scientifically studied. This could be a potential foundation for that. And this is one of the verses from Kapila's instruction to his mother Devahuti, the Sankhya philosophy. And interested readers can study this third book of Srimad Bhagavatam, 3rd canto, 26th chapter, 25th, 26th chapter. It gives a very illuminating account. So let me go quickly about the objective subtle. What is the tanmatra? Top shown. They are basically the properties of the Pancha Mahabhut. So these Pancha Mahabhuts are really subtle things. They are so subtle that we cannot see. The earth is not the earth that we are seeing. Whatever we are seeing as form, taste, odor, everything, that has already have some form. So taste or odor. So that is already very gross. So that is not the earth. So earth represents so basically the one with it is identified with its tanmatra. So basically objective subtle experience of odor. Water in this phenomenological model, it is characterized by taste. So taste is not again not to be confused with the taste that we have when we eat a sweet. It is an objective description of the world. So it's a phenomenological model. It's not a reductionist approach, I would say. So it's not a reductionist, holistic approach. In this holistic approach, the Pancha Mahabhuts are very subtle and they are characterized by further subtle tanmatras. Sound, ether is characterized by sound. So basically sound give rise to ether. Sound again is not to be confused with the sound waves. Sound can exist in 4 states. Para, Apara, Vaikhari and Madhyama. So these are the 4 stages of sound. And what we perceive as ordinary sound, like you must be hearing me. So these are ordinary sounds. So these are ordinary sounds. That is basically not to be confused. So that is basically the Vaikhari stage of sound. Like that touch, the sensation of touch, its objective description in science. So that is what described by the Sankhya philosophy. Like that form, taste, odor. And from there, touch gives rise to air, form gives rise to fire. Again, this fire is not the fire that we see when we light something. It's the objective basically description of the thing. So when sound and ether is combined, touch sensation gives. When touch is combined with air, form is evolved. So the fire and form is combined, it's taste. Water and taste combined, odor comes. And odor gives rise to earth. So whatever we are seeing in this world, they basically after when all these Pancha Mahabhutas combined together. So all these 5 names may appear very strange, and that's why it may appear absurd, but it is not really. when understood in a very framework, solid framework, it gives rise to very wonderful foundation for further research. And we know these ideas were like this famous book by Machiavelli. For around 30 years of research, he described how actually Greeks got the ideas from the Vedic culture. So certainly Greeks must have received these ideas from Vedic culture. Panchamahabhuta and similar analogies they projected in terms of geometry, but these are not really, they couldn't really get the essential purport. So the whole thing is still lying before us to explore scientifically and a very logical thing. Already people are working on that, these ideas. And when we start revising our notion of subtle matter and gross matter, Tanmatras, it really challenges the Descartes Cartesian duality. So how actually Western philosophy started? So Descartes thought that mind and matter can be separated. That means mind is something, anything, something divine or spiritual, something like that. He merged in mind category, and mind has no interaction with matter. That's why the science could be practiced. The philosophy was talking about metaphysical reality, and so he devised that. He made it for mind, and then left for science. Natural philosophy was for matter. So that way, science evolved as a separate distinction. But now we have reached a point where this Cartesian duality is to be revised. We need to include mind as subtle matter and then go beyond. There is further the conception of soul or Atma. So that is further fundamental than the subtle matter. So all these things are waiting for its researchers to come and decipher the secrets, describe in modern scientific terms. And that is how the intellectual crisis that present day fundamental science or natural science is facing, so that it's a potential ground where it can overcome. So it would really revise our conception of reality. So it's a very interesting idea. So as soon as we devise the demarcation, we have to include the role of observer and consciousness in our framework. So that means it carries the potential of solving the observation problem and the whole foundation ontological understanding of quantum mechanics. So in a nutshell, we are already too late. So in a nutshell, science cut up its ties from philosophy and became objective description of the physical world. And in its attempt, it became very successful in giving deterministic worldview. So because we had industrial revolutions and scientific revolutions, people got in objective handles over truth, but that was not the end of the story. But it kept evolving, and many intellectual crises came, and that gave rise to quantum physics and the related ideas. But that was not the end of the story. So that gave many weirdness. The quantum basically observation problem, the role of observer, we do not know how it is affecting the science, and certainly Vedic foundation, Vedic knowledge, the Eastern culture, when understood in a proper sense, it's not really absurd. So it carries the potential for further research. I hope interested readers, interested people can collaborate and carry work in this direction. Okay, thank you very much. So already we are running short of the time. So if any of you have any questions, please post in your chat box. So let me see, there are some already questions. So so Mr. Vinay Kumar is saying, so no deterministic solution to Anu Matratmak Atma, or Vibhu Matratmak Paramatma. So Atma, the soul, conception of soul is fundamental, and it is subtle than any kind of perception of matter, gross or subtle. So it's a different class. So science really cannot in its present form describe it. So to describe that, we need description of a different language. And what science can describe in materialistic framework, it describes its effect on matter. So basically how actually subtle matter is interacting with matter. There the role of Tanmatras would come. And there the role of subjective experiences and the underlying objective experience, what we call Tanmatras, that would be understood. And how actually mind and consciousness are interacting through subtle body, through the gross body, that framework is yet to be understood. And of course, Vedic knowledge gives a very phenomenological understanding, but in scientific term, it is yet to be explored. So then Vinay Kumar is saying, अतः आत्म साक्षात्कार और भगवत साक्षात्कार दोनों विषय में नॉन डिटर्मिनिस्टिक है, परंतु भक्त के लिए सरल है और टोटली डिटर्मिनिस्टिक और सब्जेक्टिव भी है. Yes, the reality has two facets, subjective and objective facets. Even though science can describe everything, but still the subjective part is not really going to go away. That's the intrinsic property of the soul, and that's the nature of soul, that it has free will, and free will